Hey buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis Skillbent is the name, and Hearthstone is the game, and these are the 10 worst cards from the Kobolds Catacombs expansion. Now, you might already be asking, how did you determine which cards are worst? Well, essentially, I used a combination of two things. Data from hsreplay.net on these cards' win rates, but I also combined that with some personal judgment calls, my opinions based on my experience, and that helped me determine a ranking for the worst cards in the set. Now, please, before you get into this video, note that I'm not saying that these cards are unplayable. You can still have fun with these cards, but often they are going to hurt the consistency or competitiveness of your deck. Doesn't mean they're fundamentally terrible things to exist. I happily enjoy playing bad cards with the rest of you guys. It's good to have cards that are fun. It's good to have meme cards. And frankly, sometimes it's good to just have bad cards to test them. And Blizzard very intentionally designed some of these cards to be bad, I'm sure. I don't think every card has to be good. This is not a judgment call or an indictment on these cards. Just a mere observation that in standard format specifically, right now, these are the worst cards from the set. These are cards that you should probably avoid when it comes to deck building. If they're cards that you're utilizing right now and you think they're working, perhaps you should assess the opportunity cost and maybe consider some replacements that might improve your deck and still fit with your game plan or strategy. So all those disclaimers aside, let's just go ahead and jump into this list, the 10 worst cards from Kobolds Catacombs. Up first is King Tog Waggle at the number 10 spot, one of the neutral legendary minions in this set, and frankly, none of them are all that strong, but this one, in my opinion, is the worst of the set, even worse than cards like the Darkness, for instance. Now, what makes King Tog Waggle so bad? Well, essentially his effect is just so darn difficult to actually achieve, and then sometimes even when you do achieve it, it's just not all that valuable, outside, of course, some super specific combos where you attempt to destroy your opponent's deck. Beyond that, this is just such a difficult card to use. The stats for its cost are so low, and although this was very recently played in a tournament deck for pro players, despite that, the data says that when you include King Tog Waggle in your deck, it plummets your win rate, and in fact, when you play this card, it doesn't help. So even when you try to pull off those silly shenanigans, it's just too much work, too inconsistent, and leaves King Tog Waggle as nothing more than probably the ultimate meme card of Kobolds Catacombs. Moving on to the number 9 spot here, we have Green Jelly. Now, this one doesn't look like a particularly terrible card at a surface level. It's got some potentially infinite value if it lingers around on board, but that's sort of the problem with this card, is that it just doesn't linger around on board. Because at only 3 health, this thing is just so darn easy to remove, particularly because it only puts a 1/2 taunt in the way, so it's not very well protected. So you're investing a lot of mana in potential future value, but the problem is that potential future value really never pays off. When you compare this to something like Sludge Belcher, for instance, a classic 5 mana card that included some taunt synergies, that gave you a 3/5 body right off the bat, so that was much sturdier in the first place. Then it also gave you that 1/2 ooze, and since those were bundled together, it was often even harder and more difficult to deal with than this, which simply means you only have to deal 2 health of taunt, and then you can just ignore it and go face. You can take really value trades into the Green Jelly. It's just far less of a high friction minion than something like Sludge Belcher. Also, of course, loses Death Rattle synergies, etc. Now, a card doesn't have to be as good as Sludge Belcher to be good, but Green Jelly is so vastly inferior to that card, you can see just how big of a gap it is. And this one just has no reason to really see play or exist. And when you look at the data, that certainly supports that. Green Jelly just doesn't seem to work. Moving on to the number 8 spot is one of the cards I think I've trash talked more than any other card in Hearthstone ever. Maybe this is the Rune Spear. I think this thing is just fundamentally awful, and it's another one of those cards that has popped into decks from time to time. You've probably seen it on ladder every once in a while, maybe like 3 times total, but that's really just people trying to make a card that's quite clearly terrible into something moderately playable. But again, when it comes back to the data, this card just fails in a miserable way, and it's very easy to see why. 8 mana is so expensive for a really, really random effect, and Shaman spells, frankly, just aren't good enough on average, or are so unpredictable to utilize on average, that even when you discover them, they just aren't helpful. They don't really contribute to the board. They don't do something you need in that moment. And you're sacrificing so much tempo in order to achieve this very, very, very minor and occasional upside that it just never makes sense to play this card. Yes, Shaman's in a tough spot right now. Rune Spear is suffering because of Shaman, but even when Shaman turns it around, I still don't think Rune Spear will ever make sense. This card just looks like a complete abject failure to me. And talking about Shaman, we're not done looking at Shaman cards. Man, Blizzard has really whiffed on designing great Shaman cards over the last couple expansions. This time around, it's Primal Talismans, a 3-mana spell that gives your minions Death Rattle, summon a random basic totem. But as you can imagine, having something die and turning into a totem is not necessarily an advantageous thing. Now you might say, oh, well, Regis, that gives you some sort of backup plan or resiliency of your board, but the problem is utilizing totems is so darn difficult. And yes, there are some other totem synergy cards that could perhaps benefit from this, but most of the time, those aren't even that good. And then on top of all of that, this is sort of a win more card. Like, it's only good when you already have a giant board of stuff, and it's only good when that giant board of stuff is perhaps value trading. So it's not even really an immunity or resiliency card because you have to have stuff on board already, which means you're already winning. So wouldn't you prefer to run things like Bloodlust, for instance, just to end the game, or some sort of evolve package? There's just not a great way to utilize this card. When you compare it to things like Soul of the Forest, for instance, for Druid, you can see just how drastically worse this is, because totems are on average much, much worse than tutus, and that's only 1 extra mana, and that's a card that still really doesn't even see play. It's not a great card itself, so Primal Talisman is much worse than a card that's already bad. That's not a very good sign. That's exactly why this card is on this list. So moving on to the next spot here, we have another Shaman card. This is the Cobold Hermit, another totem synergy card, and perhaps Shaman's difficulties and of course the totem synergy difficulties are why this card is experiencing so much trouble. When you look at its win rates, it's absolutely abysmal. Now, I didn't think this card personally was quite as bad as the win rates suggest it is, but apparently just nobody can really make it work. And when you start to look at it, right, compared to something like, just for instance, the Hero Power button, you can see why Kobold Hermit struggles. Frankly, it's just a 1/1 body attached to a totem. Now, you do get, of course, a little bit of control and choice when you summon your totem, which can very occasionally, I would argue, have some upside. For instance, you could choose a spell damage totem. Maybe you desperately need a taunt totem. But if you're in those scenarios, that means you're probably in trouble, or you're looking to synergize with a specific thing in your hand. And how often is that going to line up perfectly? Frankly, not all that often. So when you're looking to play this just on turn 2 for tempo, you don't get anything. You get an extra 1/1 body, and that's just not worth the opportunity cost of trading it for another card in your decks. You're kind of wasting a card that could be something else, could be something stronger, could be something faster. Any random 2-drop like Knife Juggler, for instance, might just be 10 times better than Kobold Hermit when it comes to on-board value. So you're essentially waiting on this card to make some sort of play, or using that influence and control of choosing your totem to make an impact. And if you're waiting a long time to do that, you're just wasting opportunity. You're wasting a card draw. And then when you do finally make that impact, it's not big enough. It's not a big enough swing or influential enough to really make the difference. Often just that spell damage could be the one instance where it's really, really good. But again, you're playing from behind. It's not the kind of way that Shaman typically likes to play, that we've seen historically, which is playing a little bit faster, utilizing onboard minions, leveraging those in a valuable way to influence the board or just outright kill your opponent. This plays sort of opposite to that a lot of the time. So there are other ways to get wide bodies on board if you're trying to get multiple minions out for a single card that are better, arguably, than Kobold Hermit. There are other ways to utilize totem synergies that are better. There are just better value 2-drops. So that leaves this in a spot where it just can't contribute all that much. So I still think there's maybe a slight glimmer of hope for this card eventually down the road, maybe, but as it stands right now, Shaman's in a rough place. Kobold Hermit is certainly not good enough to dig it out of that hole. This is a pretty bad card right now. Moving on to the number 5 spot here, we have Warriors Cobold Barbarian. And when you look at this card, hey, a 3-mana 4/4, that's pretty awesome. But the problem for Kobold Barbarian is that it just doesn't really have a reason to exist. In other words, because all control is removed from this card with its effect that it attacks a random enemy at the start of your turn, thus denying you any ability to ever attack with this card, essentially outside of perhaps a silence exactly, it just doesn't do anything you want it to do. Your opponent doesn't necessarily have to deal with it. They can play stuff that gets in the way, or at least attempts to get in the way of your Kobold Barbarian. Now, theoretically, maybe you could hit an enemy face behind a taunt, but is that really worth the downside of losing all control and running it into tiny 1/1s and just junk minions all the time? Or, in fact, even hitting face when you want to take a trade into minions. It's just that when you don't have influence, you don't have control over a card, that really makes it hard to work with. And Kobold Barbarian doesn't fit into any certain archetype, doesn't make sense in any way that Warrior traditionally wants to play. It doesn't have taunt, so action is never forced through it, so these stats don't necessarily make an impact. It can often trade in super unfavorable ways. All that said, this card is just impossible to work with. It doesn't make any sense for Warrior or, frankly, anybody else that I can tell, and that's why it's one of the worst cards in the set. So now let's move on to the number 4 spot here with Gravelsnot Knight. Now, I don't think everybody thinks this card is necessarily terrible, but when you look at the stats, indeed it is. It's awful. And if you start to break it down, you can understand why, I think, pretty quickly. Now, clearly a 2/3 for 1 mana, that's solid. We've seen that work in the past a ton with things like Zombie Chow, for instance, a similar card in theory. But Gravelsnot Knight's downside is much worse than Zombie Chow's. It's summoning a 1-cost minion for your opponent. So, frankly, sometimes it can just summon them a Gravelsnot Knight and you've accomplished nothing. Often it will summon them a minion with slightly worse stats. But the real problem is that you're giving your opponent the initiative to attack or utilize their minion before you're able to utilize yours, because you're summoning it for them, you hit the end turn button, they get to use it. So they're giving initiative. They're getting a minion that can dictate trades, that can do things. Maybe it's a 1/3 as well, so your Gravelsnot Knight doesn't even trade into it in the following turn. There's just so many ways for this to backfire. There's other great 1-drops that a lot of classes can utilize. Think Northshire Cleric, Dire Mole, Mana Worm, for instance, would be fantastic for so many different classes. Very occasionally does this actually high roll into a thing that makes a ton of sense or punishes your opponent in any way, and the slight stat upside is just not worth the risk or worth the downside. And of course the data represents and backs up that fact quite well, because this card is disastrous when you play it, even early in the game, and especially disastrous often in the late game where it's just a dead draw and a high opportunity cost card when you can run so many other synergist 1-drops with your deck, or just better, higher value cards that curve out later. So Gravelsnot Knight is another card that just looks like a complete failure. Even though the design idea in theory was cool, maybe a Zombie Chow 2.0, it's nowhere close to that good. Moving on to the number 3 spot here, we have the Kobold Apprentice. Another Kobold. Man, a lot of these just generic Kobold cards just don't make any sense. And it's not hard to see why this one is such an absolute failure. This is a mere 2/1 minion for 3 mana. They couldn't even make it a 3/1. That's really tough. And its battle cry certainly isn't terrible. It's like an arcane missiles, right? You're just pinging a few random things. That certainly has potential in a sort of dude world where there's a bunch of 1/1 minions all the time in this meta. But even in this meta, where there's so many 1/1s, so many Divine Shields, absolutely everywhere on the ladder, Kobold Apprentice still sucks. And if it can't work right now in the absolute perfect meta for it, then it's just never going to be a good card. Because ultimately, 3 mana is a lot to spend on a 1 health minion. We've seen that ever since Magma Rager has been around, right? And the inability to control how these pings actually influence the board is a big problem too. So they might just all go face. They might not hit the 1/1 you need, and then it trades right back into this thing, and you've wasted 3 mana, essentially. And often in the late game, when there's not as many 1/1s, a card like this is just completely dead, so it doesn't make any sense either. Kobold Apprentice, it needs more stats. It needs to be a 2/2. It needs to be a 3/1. It needs something to make it better. Right now, probably by design, admittedly, not all these cards necessarily are supposed to be good, but it's not good. It fails miserably. It's one of the worst cards in the set. Moving on to the number 2 spot here, we have the Toothy Chest, a 3 mana 0/4 that at the start of its turn, it gains 4 attack, essentially, and becomes a 4/4 for 3 mana. So this is a bit like the validated Doomsayer, but brought down in cost and in stats. And of course, if you get a 4/4 for 3 mana, hey, that's not too bad. That's solid. That's above what you'd expect for a 3 mana card. but frankly, still not that strong for a 3-mana card. Compared to something like Cabal Talon Priest, for instance. That gives you a huge onboard stat buff that gets instant value, and of course, it's a 3/4 anyway, so that's like 10 times better. Even if you compare this to something like Boisterous Bard from the Kobolds and Catacombs set, it doesn't look that much better from potential to immediately influence the board. It's delayed and it's passive, and of course, that's its real failure, is that it has 0 attack for an entire turn. So when you play this out, your opponent gets to do whatever they want to it with complete immunity for an entire turn. So they just take free trades into it, and you've completely wasted 3 mana. It never actually becomes a 4/4. And then even if it does somehow magically become a 4/4, your opponent might have been able to trade a couple smaller things into it, a couple 1/1, so it's already damaged, and now you get a 3/2 for 3 mana, and you still didn't influence their board. And then frankly, even if the magic scenario happens, where you get a free 3 mana 4/4, just uncontested, I should say, not free, but uncontested, then it's just a 4/4 for 3 mana, and that's really not even that exciting these days in Hearthstone. There are so many better sorts of plays and faster sorts of plays. So, best case scenario, this is a merely average card, and there are so many ways for it to not be a best case scenario that it's easy to see why Toothy Chest has one of the worst sets of win rates and played deck win rates and played win rates of every card. This one belongs in the number 2 spot. But there's one more card that's worse. It is Warlock's Cataclysm. Now this one actually surprises me a bit. I thought this card had potential. I thought this might finally be the card to put Quest Warlock, discard Warlock on the map. I thought maybe this could make the quest work. Finally, it's such a consistent way to discard a ton of stuff. But in practice, Cataclysm just doesn't work. I've tried to make it work myself multiple times. When you look at the data, this one far and away has the worst win rates of any other card on this list. It's just impossible to make this thing function in a game of Hearthstone. The biggest problem, of course, is that when you discard your hand, you're still not usually discarding enough stuff to actually matter and finish your quest. So you have to draw more and discard more. And when you're constantly discarding that many cards, you just can't keep up. So even though this does destroy all minions, theoretically clearing your opponent's board, the downsides are just too great. If you have minions on the board, of course, you're destroying your own as well. You're getting a reward, theoretically, eventually from the quest, but frankly, that quest reward just isn't any good anyway. The quest reward is not strong enough in Warlock to make it worth it. So essentially, any presumed value that Cataclysm offers doesn't actually exist. It doesn't deliver on that value. The sacrifice, the penalty you pay for any upside of clearing your opponent's board is just far too high. And trying to put this into a deck never actually works. It just doesn't make sense. Cataclysm is a failure. It is, as far as I'm concerned, the worst card in Kobolds and Catacombs. And there you have it, folks. Those are my 10 worst cards in Kobolds and Catacombs. Pretty tough set of stuff. As you can imagine, I'm not playing these. Virtually nobody is playing any of these cards. But I'm curious, if you made them work, did you find some way to make one of these cards a success? Are you playing it in a deck with a 55% win rate and it's actually contributing? It's winning games. If so, of course, please share those anecdotes. I want to hear that stuff. It's always fun. I would still challenge you that perhaps you're playing a bad card just for the memes and your deck might be better if you substituted something else. But I'd love to hear your arguments. I'd love to hear your take. So leave that in the comments below. But until then, everybody, thank you so much for watching. And until next time, game on.